Welcome back to Globewise Entertainment, the place where forgotten cinema comes back to life and hidden masterpieces finally get the recognition they deserve. Today's video is something truly special because we're diving deep into 10 mind-blowing movies from 1967 that were far ahead of their time. These films didn't just entertain audiences, they challenged storytelling, predicted the future of cinema, and experimented with ideas Hollywood wouldn't fully understand until decades later. From psychological thrillers to surreal sci-fi and visually groundbreaking masterpieces, these movies proved one thing. Great cinema doesn't age, it evolves. But before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Globewise Entertainment and join our community of true movie lovers discovering the most underrated gems in film history. Now get ready, because some of these movies were so advanced, audiences in 1967 simply weren't prepared for them. What happens when a gangster movie completely abandons logic and turns into pure cinematic madness? That's exactly why Branded to Kill became one of the most shocking cult films ever made. Directed by Seijun Suzuki, the story follows a bizarre hitman obsessed with the smell of boiling rice while competing against deadly assassins inside a violent criminal underworld. Yes, it sounds insane, and that's exactly the point. The film explodes with surreal imagery, strange humor, chaotic editing, and dreamlike violence unlike anything audiences had seen before. Back in 1967, the studio hated it so much they actually fired Suzuki for making movies they considered too weird. Critics were confused, audiences were stunned, and the film completely failed commercially. But years later, something incredible happened. Filmmakers and movie lovers began realizing Branded to Kill wasn't incompetence. It was pure artistic rebellion. Its experimental visuals and unpredictable storytelling influenced generations of directors, from Quentin Tarantino to modern neo-noir filmmakers. Today, it's celebrated as one of the boldest and most stylistically fearless crime films ever created. There are historical films, and then there are films that feel like ancient nightmares brought to life. Markéta Lazarova is one of them. Released in 1967 and directed by František Vlašel, this dark medieval epic shocked audiences with its raw brutality, poetic visuals, and haunting atmosphere unlike anything cinema had seen before. Set in a violent 13th century world filled with rival clans, betrayal, and survival, the story follows a young woman named Markéta whose life is destroyed after she becomes trapped between savage family conflicts and forbidden love. But this isn't a clean Hollywood historical drama. The movie feels wild, chaotic, and painfully realistic. Mud, snow, blood, and fear cover every frame, making the medieval world feel terrifyingly alive. Back in 1967, audiences struggled to understand its artistic style and fragmented storytelling. But over time, critics began calling it one of the greatest films ever made. Today, Markéta Lazarova is praised as a visionary masterpiece that transformed historical cinema forever. It wasn't trying to entertain audiences with fantasy. It wanted them to feel history itself, brutal, tragic, and unforgettable. In 1967, audiences expected comedy. What they got instead was one of the most visually ambitious films ever created. Playtime, directed by Jacques Tati, follows the awkward and lovable Monsieur Hewlett as he wanders through a futuristic version of Paris filled with glass buildings, endless technology, and people slowly losing human connection. But this isn't a normal comedy. There's barely any traditional plot. Instead, the movie becomes a massive visual experiment where every background detail, movement, and sound creates humor in ways audiences had never seen before. The film predicted modern urban isolation, technology addiction, and society's obsession with artificial perfection decades before these became real-world problems. At the time, the movie was considered too strange and expensive, eventually becoming a financial disaster that nearly ruined Tati's career. But over time, critics and filmmakers began recognizing its genius. Today, Playtime is viewed as a cinematic masterpiece far ahead of its era. Its breathtaking production design, clever visual storytelling, and futuristic themes now feel more relevant than ever in today's digital world. Long before modern crime comedies mixed absurd humor with social rebellion, The Happening quietly experimented with ideas that felt completely unusual for its time. Released in 1967, the film follows a group of rebellious young men who accidentally kidnap a retired mafia boss hoping to make easy money. But instead of fear and violence, the situation becomes increasingly bizarre, funny, and unpredictable as the old gangster almost enjoys being kidnapped more than his captors expected. What makes the film feel ahead of its time is how it blends satire, crime, youth culture, and dark comedy into something strangely modern. Beneath the humor lies a deeper message about generational frustration, rebellion against authority, and a society beginning to lose trust in old systems. Audiences in 1967 expected a normal gangster comedy, but The Happening constantly twisted expectations with quirky dialogue and offbeat storytelling. Because of that, it struggled to find a large audience back then. But years later, viewers started appreciating its unique personality and experimental tone. Today, the film feels like an early blueprint for the unconventional crime comedies that became hugely popular decades later. Before gritty detective thrillers became mainstream, Tony Rome quietly introduced audiences to a rough, cynical private investigator who felt far more realistic than the polished detectives Hollywood usually presented. Starring Frank Sinatra in one of his coolest performances, the film follows Tony Rome, a former cop-turned-private detective living on a houseboat while investigating a dangerous case involving missing diamonds, corruption, and murder. But beneath the crime story lies something deeper. The movie captures loneliness, moral decay, and emotional exhaustion in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Sinatra doesn't play a glamorous hero. He feels tired, flawed, and constantly surrounded by people hiding dark secrets. The atmosphere is stylish yet melancholic, almost predicting the neo-noir detective films that exploded years later. Audiences in 1967 expected a smooth crime thriller, but Tony Rome delivered something moodier and more character-driven. Over time, viewers began appreciating its realistic dialogue, sharp tension, and grounded storytelling. Today, the film stands as an underrated detective classic that helped shape the darker crime movies audiences now love. What if one of the most stylish gangster films ever made was completely overshadowed by bigger crime classics? The St. Valentine's Day Massacre wasn't just another mafia movie. Directed by Roger Corman, the film recreated the infamous 1929 Chicago gang war with shocking realism, brutal violence, and documentary-style storytelling that felt decades ahead of its time. Instead of romanticizing criminals, the movie exposed the cold, calculated world of organized crime in a way that feels closer to modern crime dramas than classic Hollywood films. The atmosphere is tense, gritty, and loaded with paranoia as rival gangs move toward one of the most infamous massacres in American history. What makes the film so fascinating today is how realistic and grounded it feels. The narration style, raw violence, and historical accuracy predicted the tone later seen in films like Goodfellas and Casino. Back in 1967, audiences expected glamorous gangster entertainment, but this movie delivered something darker and more disturbing. Over time, it became a forgotten gem that now feels incredibly modern. At first glance, Caprice looks like a colorful romantic comedy from the 1960s, but underneath the glamorous surface hides something surprisingly strange and experimental. Starring Doris Day, the film follows a cosmetics expert who suddenly becomes trapped inside an international espionage conspiracy involving stolen formulas, secret agents, and dangerous corporate rivalries. But what makes Caprice feel ahead of its time isn't just the story. It's the bizarre mix of spy thriller, satire, fashion comedy, and psychedelic visual style that feels almost like a futuristic parody of modern action comedies. The film constantly shifts tone, blending absurd humor with stylish suspense in ways audiences back then didn't fully appreciate. Critics were confused because it didn't behave like a normal comedy or a traditional spy movie. But today, the film feels strangely modern, almost like an early blueprint for self-aware action comedies that became popular decades later. The vibrant cinematography, exaggerated performances, and unpredictable pacing make Caprice feel less like a forgotten 1960s film and more like an experimental cinematic time capsule waiting to be rediscovered. Imagine a political thriller so bizarre and intelligent that audiences in 1967 couldn't decide whether it was comedy, science fiction, or terrifying social commentary. That's exactly what happened with The President's Analyst. The film follows a psychiatrist hired to become the personal therapist of the President of the United States. But the pressure of hearing the nation's darkest secrets slowly drives him into paranoia until he becomes the target of spies, secret agencies, and mysterious organizations hunting him across America. What starts as satire quickly transforms into something shockingly prophetic. The movie predicted government surveillance, loss of privacy, corporate control, and mass communication addiction decades before these fears became reality. At the time, audiences were confused by its strange humor and surreal storytelling. But today, the film feels disturbingly accurate. Its wild conspiracy themes, absurd political satire, and futuristic ideas now resemble the kind of psychological thrillers modern audiences celebrate. What once looked ridiculous in 1967 now feels uncomfortably believable. And that's exactly why The President's Analyst became one of the most underrated cult classics of its era. What if a movie wasn't trying to entertain you, but trying to warn you that society itself was collapsing? That's exactly what Weekend did in 1967, and audiences had absolutely no idea what they were watching. Directed by legendary filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, this surreal French masterpiece follows a wealthy couple traveling through the countryside to claim an inheritance. Sounds simple, right? But the journey slowly transforms into complete chaos. Endless traffic jams, violent encounters, disturbing accidents, and bizarre philosophical conversations begin to blur reality itself. The film abandons normal storytelling and instead creates a nightmare vision of greed, consumerism, and social collapse. Back then, critics called it confusing and overly experimental. But decades later, viewers realized something shocking. Weekend predicted the modern world's obsession with materialism, media overload, and emotional emptiness long before these themes became common in cinema. The movie feels angry, chaotic, and strangely prophetic. Today, it's considered one of the boldest and most revolutionary films ever made, a cinematic warning audiences only fully understood years later. Sometimes silence can be more powerful than dialogue, and no movie proves that better than Le Samurai. Released in 1967, this French crime thriller completely changed how cool, lonely assassins would be portrayed in cinema forever. Directed by Jean-Pierre Melville and starring Alain Delon, the story follows Jeff Costello, a professional hitman living a cold, isolated existence inside a small Paris apartment. He barely speaks, barely shows emotion, and moves through the city like a ghost. But after a carefully planned assassination goes wrong, police begin closing in while betrayal slowly surrounds him from every direction. What makes the film extraordinary is its atmosphere. Minimal dialogue, slow pacing, and icy cinematography create a hypnotic tension rarely seen at the time. Audiences in 1967 expected fast crime action, but Le Samurai delivered something quiet, artistic, and psychologically deep. Years later, filmmakers everywhere began copying its style. From modern neo-noir thrillers to lonely antiheroes like John Wick and Drive, the influence of this movie can still be seen everywhere today. And that wraps up our list of 10 mind-blowing 1967 movies that were far ahead of their time. These films weren't just movies, they were cinematic risks that challenged storytelling, predicted future trends, and proved that true masterpieces are often misunderstood when they first arrive. Some were ignored, some failed at the box office, and others confused audiences completely. But decades later, they survived because great cinema never truly disappears. It waits for the world to finally catch up. Now we want to hear from you. Which movie on today's list surprised you the most? And is there another forgotten 1967 masterpiece you think deserves to be featured in Part 2? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through hidden cinematic history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Globewise Entertainment for more underrated films, forgotten classics, and untold Hollywood stories. Until next time, keep discovering the cinema the world almost forgot.